14 minutes past midnight. The pediatric psych ward had been silent for 4 months. Then the screaming started. 6-year-old Emma thrashed against her restraints, protecting the teddy bear crushed against her chest. 3 psychiatrists had failed to take it, not since the Navy SEALs folded the flag. The blonde rookie nurse leaned closer. The bear's stitching glinted wrong. Something hard shifted inside. Something metallic. When she reached for her scissors, she didn't know she would find GPS coordinates etched into a bullet casing and a voice from the grave that would make a silent child whisper her first word. Daddy. Emma Hale hadn't spoken since the knock on her door in March. Her father, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hale, died in a classified op in Syria. Military doctors called it conversion disorder. She simply stopped being present. The teddy bear arrived 3 days after the funeral, mailed from overseas with no return address. For 4 months, it never left her grip. Now, as the night shift began, the rookie nurse would discover why this 6-year-old protected that stuffed animal like it contained secrets worth killing for, and she was right. The bear weighed exactly 3 pounds more than it should have. Sarah Mitchell noticed this on her 3rd night shift at Walter Reed's pediatric psychiatry ward, weighing the girl's belongings during a routine intake review that nobody else had bothered to complete in 4 months. Emma Hale had been transferred from Johns Hopkins after the incident with the 2nd psychiatrist, the one who'd tried to confiscate the toy for sterilization, and ended up needing 17 stitches across his forearm. For 122 days, Emma had existed in a state of medical limbo that the diagnostic manuals called conversion disorder with catatonic features. Eyes open but unseeing, body rigid when approached. The only voluntary movement came when fingers brushed the synthetic fur of that bear. Then she became something feral, teeth bared, nails raking, a 6-year-old child requiring chemical restraint to prevent self-injury during the violent episodes that occurred whenever staff attempted separation. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hale had died on March 15th in the Deir ez-Zor province of Syria. The official Department of Defense report cited direct enemy contact during a classified Joint Special Operations Task Force mission. The unofficial whispers that reached the ward through military family support networks mentioned a collapsed building, a missed extraction window, a body recovered too damaged for open casket burial. Emma received the bear 3 days after the funeral, postmarked from Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. No return address, no accompanying note, just the stuffed animal wrapped in brown paper and clear tape. Dr. Aris had tried cognitive behavioral therapy through art. Dr. Venn had attempted progressive muscle relaxation and somatic experiencing. The chief of psychiatry had pushed for electroconvulsive therapy, stopped only by Emma's grandmother's legal intervention and the media attention that followed. Nothing worked because nobody understood that the bear wasn't a comfort object, it was a dead drop. Sarah was 26, 6 weeks out of Georgetown's nursing program, previously an Air Force dependent who had lived on bases from Okinawa to Ramstein. She knew military-grade stitching when she saw it. The seams on that bear were too precise, too uniform, the work of someone trained to conceal equipment in hostile territory under time constraints, the sort of fieldcraft taught in survival, evasion, resistance, and escape school. At 2:14 in the morning, during the 40-minute window when the ward's surveillance system rotated its blind spot between camera 4 and camera 5, Sarah lifted the bear from Emma's sleeping grip. The girl didn't wake, heavily sedated on lorazepam after her evening rage episode, but her fingers twitched in involuntary protest. Sarah felt the weight shift immediately as she hefted the toy. A dense cylinder nestled in the thoracic cavity, hard and unyielding against the polyester fill, shifting like a pendulum when tilted. She used trauma shears from the crash cart, the heavy-duty blades designed to cut through leather and denim in emergency situations. The scissors snagged on something that wasn't fabric 3 inches below the neckline. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled apart the white synthetic fluff. Brass gleamed dully in the fluorescent hospital light. A bullet casing, 9mm parabellum etched with tiny, precise numbers that looked like coordinates along the casing wall. And beneath it, wedged into the padding, something smaller and plastic. A micro SD card no bigger than her fingernail, the kind used in satellite phones and high-security data transfers. Her radio crackled against her hip. Security was making rounds early, footsteps echoing in the hallway outside room 412. Sarah had perhaps 10 seconds to hide what she'd found or explain why she was destroying a dead Navy SEAL's final gift to his catatonic daughter. She looked closer at the numbers etched in the metal. 34 degrees, 22 minutes north, 40 degrees, 31 minutes east. Something in her chest tightened with a certainty she couldn't name. Those coordinates weren't pointing to a grave in Arlington. They were pointing somewhere active, somewhere current, somewhere with prisoners. Sarah slipped the bullet casing into her scrub pocket and palmed the SD card into her watch band, sliding the shears back into the crash cart, just as the door handle turned. It was Marcus, the overnight security supervisor, checking the room with his flashlight beam cutting across Emma's sleeping form. Sarah stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, until the beam passed over her and moved on. The door clicked shut. She had perhaps 3 minutes before the next rotation. She found an empty supply closet on the ward's east wing, the one with the broken lock that maintenance hadn't fixed since February. Her hands shook as she extracted the SD card, smaller than a postage stamp, and inserted it into her phone using the adapter she kept for transferring patient photos. The screen flashed once, a single audio file, 7 seconds long. She pressed play and held the device to her ear, volume low, barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. Static, then breathing, controlled, measured, the respiration pattern of a man who knew he was being recorded under duress. Marcus Hale's voice emerged from the digital silence, hoarse but deliberate. 34 degrees, 22 minutes north, 40 degrees, 31 minutes east. Daddy's coming home, sweetheart. The recording ended. Sarah listened again, and a third time. The coordinates were precise, military grid reference system format, but the tone was wrong. Not a farewell message, a target package. She returned to room 412 with the audio file ready on her phone. Emma lay exactly as before, eyes closed, chest rising in the shallow rhythm of chemical sedation. Sarah knelt beside the bed, close enough to smell the antiseptic in the girl's hair and the faint vanilla scent of the bear's stuffing. She pressed play one more time, holding the speaker inches from Emma's ear, gambling everything on a hunch that the human brain processes familiar voices even in catatonic withdrawal. 34 degrees, 22 minutes north. Emma's eyelids fluttered. Daddy's coming home, sweetheart? The girl's lips parted. A sound emerged, rusty and broken, like a door hinge unused for years. Daddy, the word hung in the air, impossibly small, devastating in its clarity. Sarah froze, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell. Then Emma's eyes opened fully for the first time in 122 days, lucid and aware, and she reached for the bear with hands that no longer clawed but clutched with desperate recognition. The breakthrough shattered the ward's routine. Dr. Aris arrived at 6:15, still in his overcoat, to find Emma sitting upright in bed, clutching the bear, responding to her name with nods and single words, yes, no, bear, daddy. But when he tried to remove the toy for examination, the screaming returned high and operatic until Sarah intervened and returned the bear to Emma's grip. The psychiatrist pulled Sarah into the hallway, demanding an explanation for the sudden recovery, asking what she had done during the night shift. Sarah told him about the stitching, about the weight, about the coordinates etched into military-grade brass that didn't match any known burial site in Syria. She showed him the audio file, played him the 7 seconds of Marcus Hale's voice, watched the blood drain from the doctor's face as he realized what they were holding. These aren't memorial coordinates, Sarah said. These are grid coordinates for a facility still operational. Deir ez-Zor province, 17 kilometers from the officially reported kill zone. Dr. Aris understood immediately. If Chief Hale had embedded operational coordinates in his daughter's toy 3 days after his reported death, then either the timeline was wrong or the body recovered by JSOC wasn't his. The implications collapsed inward, like a demolition charge. A Navy SEAL listed as killed in action who was alive long enough to smuggle intelligence out of enemy territory, a black site location that didn't appear on any congressional oversight map, and a child who had been protecting the only evidence that 2 American servicemen were still being held captive in a region officially declared cleared of personnel. By 8:30, NCIS had arrived. Not the local field office investigators who handled petty theft and drug offenses on base, but the Special Operations Squad from Quantico, the ones who wore civilian clothes and carried credentials that didn't scan in standard databases. They took Sarah's phone first, downloading the audio file into a hardened device that looked like a brick of black plastic. Then they took the bear, cutting it open with less ceremony than Sarah had used, photographing the bullet casing, running the coordinates through satellite feeds that accessed layers of imagery far beyond Google Earth. The lead agent was a woman named Carver, late 40s, gray hair pulled tight, the kind of posture that suggested years of carrying heavy equipment in bad places. She didn't ask Sarah how she knew to look for the dead drop. She asked instead about Emma's reaction to the audio, specifically the word daddy, specifically the timing. She took notes on a paper pad, not a tablet, recording details about catatonic states and selective mutism with the clinical interest of someone who understood that trauma responses were intelligence indicators. By noon, the ward had become a secure site. Uniformed military police blocked the elevators. The hospital administrator arrived with a lawyer in tow, demanding warrants, receiving instead a single sheet of paper with a classification header that made him pale and silent. Sarah remained in room 412, technically detained, technically protected, watching Emma feed herself applesauce with mechanical precision, watching the girl's eyes track every entrance and exit with an awareness that belied her 6 years. Carver returned at 2 in the afternoon with satellite imagery printed on paper that smelled like toner and ozone. She spread the photographs on the bed table, showing Sarah a compound built into the side of a limestone ridge, 17 kilometers from the collapse site. Thermal imaging from 48 hours prior showed heat signatures consistent with generator exhaust and human occupancy. Not a grave, a prison. They were still alive, Carver said. Chief Hale didn't die in the building collapse. He died 3 days later, getting this out. She tapped the bullet casing. The SD card was the backup. The primary message was always meant for Emma. He knew they'd check her belongings eventually. He knew the bear would make it through customs while anything mailed to command would be intercepted. Sarah looked at the girl who had stopped eating and was staring at the satellite photos with an expression of profound recognition. Emma pointed to the ridgeline with a sticky finger and whispered 2 words that changed everything. Daddy's there, not was, is, present tense. As if she knew, had always known, that the man they buried in Arlington was someone else, a body switched or misidentified, and that her silence had been not grief but waiting for someone to listen to the bear. Carver's radio crackled with encryption static. She stepped into the hallway to answer, her voice dropping to a murmur that Sarah couldn't catch. When she returned, her expression had shifted from investigation to operation. Wheels are turning, she said. But there's a problem. Someone at JSOC is pushing back on the rescue authorization. They're claiming the coordinates are stale, that Chief Hale was compromised, that this is an ambush setup. They're requesting 72 hours to verify through alternative intelligence. Emma looked up from her applesauce, her eyes meeting Sarah's with a clarity that made the nurse's skin prickle. They don't want them back, the girl said, her voice steady and cold. They want the secret to stay buried. And as Carver's radio crackled again with urgent traffic about a helicopter inbound to the hospital roof, Sarah realized that the opposition wasn't foreign. It was wearing the same uniform as the men who had come to fold the flag on Emma's porch 4 months ago. The rescue was authorized, but so was the cover-up, and they had perhaps 20 minutes to decide which one would reach that compound in Deir ez-Zor first. The helicopter blades cut the air above Walter Reed with a rhythmic thud that vibrated through Sarah's sternum, rattling the glass in the ward doors. Carver's radio crackled again, and she listened with a stillness that betrayed her military background, her face draining of color as the transmission ended. "It's Vance," she said quietly. JSOC Deputy Director. He brought a full tactical team from the Pentagon's Special Activities Division, not to rescue, to sanitize. Sarah grabbed Emma's hand, the girl's fingers cold and rigid in her grip, still clutching the ruined bear with its white stuffing trailing like viscera. They moved fast down the service corridor, past linen carts and biohazard bins, while Carver stayed behind to stall the approaching team, her hand resting casually on the sidearm at her hip. The nurse found the old pharmaceutical storage room on the basement level, the one marked for renovation with a broken lock she remembered from her orientation tour, and pushed Emma inside behind stacks of collapsed cardboard boxes and expired saline bags. The girl's breathing was shallow, but her eyes were sharp, calculating, ancient in a way that childhood trauma sometimes carved into the young. "They know I'm the key," Emma whispered, her voice steadier than it had been in months. "Daddy said they would come when the bear was opened. He said the wrong people would wear the right uniforms. Sarah crouched to her level, trying to understand how a 6-year-old could speak with such certainty, with the tactical awareness of a soldier's daughter. What else did he say? Emma reached into her mouth and pulled out a tiny object, no larger than a grain of rice, that had been hidden under her tongue for 4 months, preserved against detection by sheer will and saliva, a subdermal data chip. The serial number etched into its metallic surface matched the primer stamp on the bullet casing. Meanwhile, Carver confronted Vance in the hallway outside room 412. The deputy director wore civilian tactical gear indistinguishable from special operators and carried a tablet displaying executive orders that legally didn't exist yet, signed by the Secretary of Defense under emergency continuity protocols. The coordinates are compromised. Vance stated flatly, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man used to ending conversations. Chief Hale was turned by his captors during the initial 48 hours. That message is disinformation designed to draw us into an ambush that would expose our satellite capabilities. But Carver noticed the tremor in his left hand, the microscopic tell of a man lying about military intelligence he'd helped bury 18 weeks ago. The tablet showed satellite footage from 12 hours ago, time-stamped after the initial thermal imaging. The compound was empty, ghost town, but Carver recognized the metadata manipulation immediately. The shadows were wrong for the solar angle in Deir ez-Zor at that time of day. Someone had altered the footage to show abandonment, and done it hastily. "Why are you so afraid of a dead man's voice?" Carver asked, stepping closer. Vance didn't answer. He signaled his men to search the ward, room by room, with instructions to secure the child and any materials she had come into contact with. Sarah, listening through the door crack, realized the hospital was being locked down not to protect Emma, but to disappear her into the same black hole that had swallowed Colin Park. She pulled out the bullet casing again, examining the etching under the flashlight of her phone. The coordinates were surface level, obvious. But beneath them, etched in microfine lines visible only at a specific angle against LED light, were 2 names, Cole and Park, Lieutenant James Cole and Sergeant First Class David Park. The 2 soldiers officially listed as killed in action in the same building collapse as Hale, but they weren't dead. They were the prisoners being held at those coordinates, kept alive for interrogation about what they'd witnessed. The realization hit Sarah like ice water. The mission that supposedly killed Hale hadn't been counterterrorism. It had been a termination order disguised as combat. Cole and Park had witnessed something catastrophic. Perhaps weapons transferred to banned groups. Perhaps a deliberate bombing of civilians. Perhaps the assassination of a political figure. Hale had tried to extract them as whistleblowers rather than follow the stand-down order. The building collapsed because JSOC called in an airstrike on their own position. And now Vance needed to ensure the only remaining witnesses stayed buried, including the daughter who carried the proof. Emma tugged Sarah's sleeve, holding up the chip. Sarah inserted it into her phone using the adapter. A second audio file appeared, encrypted, time-stamped 48 hours after the first message. Not Hale's voice this time. A different man, weak, dehydrated, speaking in clipped military code. "This is Revenant 6. We have confirmation on Operation Clean Sweep. The Secretary knows. Repeat, the Secretary knows. Package is alive but fading. Send the cavalry or send nothing." The date stamp was yesterday. It got worse. The cover-up reached the Secretary of Defense himself. This wasn't a rogue officer covering his tracks. This was official policy, sanctioned at the highest levels of civilian command. The 2 soldiers weren't just captured by enemy forces. They were being held by American intelligence proxies in a deniable site to keep them silent. Until after the midterm elections and the defense appropriations vote. Rescuing them wouldn't just expose a failed mission. It would expose a conspiracy that reached the Oval Office, a secret war within the war. Heavy boots echoed in the corridor outside. Vance's team was sweeping room by room, efficient and silent. Sarah looked at Emma, who had gone silent again, retreating into her protective shell, but her hand remained firmly clasped in Sarah's, the trust absolute. The nurse made a decision that would end her career, her clearance, and possibly her life. She texted the coordinates, the names, and the second audio file to a number Carver had given her in the first moments of their meeting. A direct line to the commander of Delta Force's C Squadron, a man who owed Marcus Hale a blood debt from Baghdad in 2019. The response came in 30 seconds. Wheels up, 0 dark 30, unauthorized, no exfil guarantee. Sarah understood the code. They were going anyway. off the books, rogue. If they were caught, they were war criminals. If they succeeded, they would be ghosts. Carver burst into the storage room, gun drawn but lowered, her face slick with sweat. "They're 2 minutes out. We have to move." But Emma wouldn't budge. She pointed at the wall, at a ventilation grate high in the corner. Daddy said to go up, not out. He said the roof. The child had somehow memorized the hospital's architectural evacuation plans from a blueprint she'd seen once, months ago during her initial intake interview when the doctors weren't paying attention. Unlikely, impossible, but the logic of a child who trusted her father's instructions over adult confusion. They climbed. Sarah boosted Emma into the ventilation shaft, then crawled in after her, the bullet casing heavy in her pocket, the chip now embedded in the lining of her shoe. Below, they heard Vance's men breach the storage room. The shout of confusion and anger when they found it empty. The immediate call for a full building lockdown. On the roof, dawn was breaking over the Capitol, pink and gold and obscenely beautiful. The city waking to another Tuesday. A second helicopter waited, civilian, unmarked, rotors spinning. Carver's extraction arranged through channels that didn't exist. But as they ran toward it, another sound cut through the morning air. The roar of F-16s in tight formation, low and fast, heading east toward the Atlantic and the refueling points beyond. The cavalry wasn't asking permission anymore. They were already crossing into Syrian airspace. And somewhere in the desert, 17 kilometers from a collapsed lie that had buried 3 good men, 2 American soldiers were about to learn that a 6-year-old girl who refused to speak and a rookie nurse who refused to look away had decided their lives were worth more than the secrets keeping them in chains. The helicopter blades whipped Sarah's hair as she lifted Emma into the cabin, the girl clutching the remnants of the bear against her chest. Vance burst onto the roof moments later, weapon drawn, but Carver had already disabled his backup aircraft with a single precise shot to the hydraulic line. They vanished into the morning haze while below, the hospital descended into a lockdown that would last 9 hours. By the time Vance's team secured the building, the unmarked bird had touched down at Andrews Air Force Base, transferring Emma and Sarah to a secure briefing room where a 3-star general waited with encrypted satellite phones. 7 hours later, the call came through from a scratched sat phone in the Syrian desert. Delta Force C Squadron had breached the limestone compound at 0430 local time. They found Lieutenant Cole and Sergeant First Class Park chained to a wall in the sub-basement, dehydrated, beaten but alive. The guards wore no insignia and carried weapons registered to a shell company in Delaware linked to the Secretary of Defense's brother-in-law. The prisoners had survived 122 days on IV fluids, kept alive not for information but for execution once the political timing allowed. Marcus Hale's body was not in the compound. According to Cole, speaking through cracked lips as medics worked on him in the extraction helicopter, Hale had died 12 kilometers east during the exfiltration, drawing enemy fire so the 2 wounded men could reach the Turkish border with the intel. He had carried the bullet casing for 3 days through hostile territory, mailing the bear from a civilian post office in Turkey before doubling back to create the diversion that cost him his life. He had chosen to be a father first and a soldier second, and in the end he had managed to be both. The fallout arrived in devastating waves. The Secretary of Defense resigned, citing health reasons 48 hours later, his replacement immediately ordering a full Inspector General investigation into Operation Clean Sweep. Vance was arrested by FBI agents in plain clothes, led away from his McLean home while neighbors watched, charged with conspiracy to commit murder and treason. The contractors at the site disappeared into federal custody, singing to prosecutors about black budgets and rendition programs that had operated for 6 years without congressional oversight. Emma Hale became the youngest witness ever placed in the Federal Protection Program, not because anyone threatened her, but because her testimony, clear, precise, articulated in full sentences that emerged gradually over the following weeks, became the foundation for 3 separate congressional inquiries. She described the bear's arrival with perfect recall, the weight of it, the way her father had made her practice holding it until the doctors came. Then came the final revelation that stunned the investigators into silence. Marcus had trained her in a simple military memory code, a game he called Secrets, where certain numbers meant certain things and silence meant survival. She had known the coordinates represented people, not places. She had understood that Daddy wanted her to stay quiet until someone worthy found the bear. Her silence wasn't trauma. It was operational security for a 6-year-old living dead drop. Sarah Mitchell received an other than honorable discharge from her nursing position, officially for unauthorized disclosure of sensitive materials, though the hearing officer apologized while signing the papers. She accepted the consequences without protest and moved into a small house in Annapolis, 2 blocks from Emma's new guardian, a retired admiral who had served with Marcus and Bud S. and became the only civilian authorized to visit without supervision. On the day Cole and Park arrived at Walter Reed for their reunion with the girl who saved them, Sarah was there holding the repaired bear, its stitching now done by hand with golden thread. The 2 soldiers knelt before Emma, their faces scarred, eyes carrying the hollow look of men who had seen the inside of America's shadow. Cole reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of waterproof paper sealed in a baggie that Hale had pressed into his hand during the final firefight. A letter written in the dust of the compound, addressed to his daughter. Emma took it with steady hands and read it aloud, her voice no longer rusty but strong, the voice of a child who had carried the weight of a nation's secrets and remained unbroken. "You were always my backup plan," she read, her father's words filling the room. "Not because you're small enough to hide things, but because you're strong enough to keep them. When you speak again, speak the truth. When they ask what you remember, remember everything. I didn't die for a mission, I died for a friend, 2 of them, and when you hug them, you're hugging me." Cole and Park held her then, the 3 of them connected by the man who had bound them together with stitching and steel. Sarah watched from the doorway, the bullet casing, now decommissioned and etched with Emma's name on the reverse side, heavy in her pocket. The coordinates had led to life, not death. The silence had protected truth, not buried it. And a 6-year-old girl who refused to let go of her teddy bear had changed the course of a war most Americans would never know was fought. As the sun set over the Chesapeake, painting the water in shades of bronze that matched the shell in her hand, Sarah finally understood that some rescues don't end when the helicopters return. They end when the silence breaks and the children speak again, and the secrets stop being weapons. The story of Emma Hale didn't make the evening news. It couldn't. The congressional testimonies were sealed, the records classified, the rescuers officially listed as conducting routine training exercises, but in the years since, 17 similar cases have surfaced across military hospital networks, children clutching objects too heavy for their size, bearing coordinates too precise for their age, protecting truths too dangerous for open court. We pass them in grocery stores, see them at airports clutching stuffed animals and blankets, and we assume their silence is grief when sometimes it is the last line of defense against a darkness most of us will never have to carry. Marcus Hale chose to trust his daughter with the truth because he knew that innocence is the only camouflage that never fails. Sarah Mitchell chose to listen when others saw only pathology, and somewhere tonight in a ward, much like the one where Emma waited, another child is holding something that isn't just a toy, waiting for someone brave enough to wonder why the weight is wrong, why the stitching is military grade, why the silence persists past the point of mourning. The question isn't whether these stories exist. They do, hidden in plain sight, buried in bureaucracy, waiting in the quiet between heartbeats. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of that bullet casing and understood what it meant to protect truth with silence, then stay with us. Subscribe, not because you want more content, but because these voices, kept silent for too long, deserve witnesses. Hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to know that sometimes the smallest hands carry the heaviest secrets. And remember, when you see a child who won't let go, don't ask them to drop it, ask them what they're holding. You might just set someone free.